Take us home, sweet Chivers.
Yeah, it's always everyone tries to end a podcast on like a sort of fun, jokey story, and this week our fun, jokey story is toxic masculinity and violence against young women. And
We're going to have to really do better in our research for next one. And audience, I'm sorry, we went away for a month. Everything happened. Like
yeah,
it's, we'll be back with some lighter stuff next week, I promise,
yeah,
or
yeah,
or more invigorating, joyful, and inspiring stuff. But
yeah.
anyways, yes, toxic
Yeah,
masculinity.
so this is Adolescence. This is the latest hit Netflix drama about a teenage boy who murders his female classmate, and then each episode of the show kind of goes through different moments, like the process of him getting arrested, the police interviewing other pupils in the school to try and find out what happened, the murderer's interview with a psychologist, with the psychologist trying to understand the kind of mentality and the roots of why he committed this murder against a teenage girl, and then looking at the experience of his parents kind of living through the aftermath of having a violent, misogynist, Andrew Tate inspired murderer for a son. I mean, as a show, it's fine. It's sort of technically impressive. Each episode's done in like one shot takes. That's kind of cool to see how they had to physically take the time to record single takes of what they were doing. The young actors in it are very good. It's sort of, they're very powerful, well acted moments. But actually, what's really got me pissed off about this show is the kind of political response to it. Or more accurately, the completely embarrassing, pathetic politician and media commentary at Lovin' with Netflix, which is all about having conversations and shining a spotlight and talking to your children rather than actually like directly tackling the root causes of toxic masculinity and online indoctrination that's poisoning many young men, or even like most importantly, and the bit that the show itself kind of completely overlooks, is what can be done to try and stop the horrific, violent, and repressive impact of this kind of new culture on young women. Like, that's something that the show itself doesn't even talk about, like, the impact on the family of the murdered young girl, or on her friends, or on young women more generally. A lot of the focus on the show is like, oh, his parents are really sad that he murdered this girl. What a horrible thing for them to experience. Like, it's all sort of passed off as secondhand. So that's, like, part of my problem with the show. But, like, yeah, the political response to it, I think, has been epitomised by Keir Starmer meeting with the show's writers and with Netflix executives in Downing Street to praise Netflix for making the show free for schools to show to their students, which, by the way, is such an obviously fucking impotent and pathetic way to think about addressing toxic masculinity, as if like something in this show is going to be new or shocking or revelatory to 13-year-olds, even if it has led to a lot of kind of pearl clutching from liberal commentators in very comfortable backgrounds who are just like, oh, I didn't know schools were a little bit messy these days. Gosh, those pupils are very loud. Golly, it looks like it must be horrible to be arrested by the police. Like, that's sort of been the primary reaction of the show, is like, it depicts some things that are a bit heavy, but it doesn't actually address, like, where this culture of toxic masculinity is coming from, what the actual content that young men are being exposed to, young women are being exposed to, and sort of objectified and humiliated and had horrible sexual violence directed against them because of this content. Like, none of that is in the show. It's all about the slightly awkward, iffy experience of this murderer and his family. But then in this meeting, like, Starmer, who, let's not forget, is like the Prime Minister of the UK, right? He has actual power to do stuff. Goes on and on about how the show was brilliant for starting conversations, for shining a spotlight on the issues, like, generally really vague stuff, not actually saying what are the issues, what is the horrifying content that needs to be stopped. But like he said, the thing that really stuck out to me, what he said was, there isn't an obvious policy response to these questions, right? So the government response is, making a Netflix show free in schools is a really good way to address toxic masculinity, but we couldn't possibly do anything like providing free youth clubs as spaces for like young men and women to interact away from social media, or providing universal access to mental health support and care for people who are struggling with their understandings and growing up. Not about free school meals as a kind of social lever. None of these things that like a government can actually tangibly do to try and address some of the underlying root causes. Certainly not like regulating online platforms or, trying to actually have control on the kind of violent, horrifying, illegal content that's on social media. Not doing anything like that, but making sure that you sit down a bunch of 13-year-olds in a classroom to watch a pretty middling TV show about something that is just like,
Whoa, whoa,
it's
Chivers.
just that's really what's pissed me off about it. Not so much the show itself, though I do have like major issues actually with what the actual narrative and focus of the show of Adolescence is, but just the pathetic surrender of political responsibility for dealing with this really deeply dangerous and serious matter of toxic masculinity, surrendering responsibility for dealing with that to a fucking streaming platform, and the Prime Minister basically providing state PR for a couple of episodes of TV with Stephen Graham in it. Like, it's such a, like,
Hey,
really
that was
pathetic...
some pretty good TV, I hear.
It was okay. It's not like, it's not going to
Wow.
blow you away. But like, also, like, there's another element to this which is like, it's another sign of the kind of powerlessness of TV drama as a mechanism for inspiring and making political material change actually happen. You know, people have been talking about like Kathy Come Home, which was a 1960s bit of socialist realism, actually not social realism, socialist realism, done by Ken Loach, about unemployment, poverty, the corrupt rental sector, homelessness. It's credited, like, Shelter was launched just before Kathy Come Home came out, and it's sort of credited with really helping to raise the public profile of Shelter. Homelessness is still a really big problem in the UK. So maybe this kind of TV drama, which everyone lauds for talking about homelessness, didn't have the kind of impact that people praise it for.
Again, hold up. Come on now, Chivers. It would have given impetus to tackling homelessness.
It did. I'm not saying it did
Homelessness
nothing.
re-became a big problem.
Sure.
It didn't stay static. I think when you look at the US, you see that actually what they're very good at doing is engaging in culture over material change, actually, to make people feel things and move them on issues and then create material change from it. And I think those cultural moments, again, we saw it with the post office drama. We
didn't. I'm sorry, we didn't. We've seen it. That was an issue in the public domain for over a decade. Right, that was being. There was real investigative journalism about the post office scandal, and it was there in the domain for decades. People were still being arrested or prosecuted up until 2 years ago, and now this political drama's come out and exposed it, and lots of politicians have been patting themselves on the back for saying, "Hasn't this?" And like, nothing's been really done about it. Like, the prosecutions are still there. There's not been any kind of like amnesty, or there's still. People have still lost a lot of money from this, and there's not been any sort of retribution from it. It's brought it to political attention for a couple of months, but like, the underlying corporate corruption and cover-up is still there. In the same way that, like, yes, Shelter had a massive burst of like public support, and homelessness is dealt with in a very different way. It didn't change the material way in which politicians, people in power, actually approach these questions.
But that's as much on organisers as anyone else. Like, if Shelter did take advantage of Kathy Come Home, I don't think like there was a vehicle for people to pour their outrage around the post office scandal into. I think you can take cultural moments and be prepared for them. I think, for instance, when we're working on media reform, one of the things is we're preparing for that moment when people really give a shit about it again, and saying, we've actually got some answers and you can come and join us. Like, that's what you've got to be doing. Like, organisers work away in the background, but because I think with the post office drama they were working on legal cases, that's a problem. And because it's not a movement, and I think, by the way, that's why 10 years of investigative journalism didn't go anywhere, because they didn't form a campaign group or anything, and that's something I think the audience can take away with them. Is like, if you want to create change, you've got to create an organization that becomes a vehicle for the moment that people actually are interested to get involved and actually do something and make change. Because you're right, like, a couple of months of outrage, which, by the way, is quite a significant amount of time for outrage to occur. More than a day is impressive, right? A couple of months of outrage not being utilised is still not enough. It's not sustained enough impact, and of course, if it's not being channeled, it will not create any change.
I mean, my problem here is not with organisers or people who bring these issues to public light through drama or culture or art or different kinds of public interpretation. My problem is what it kind of reveals about the underlying logic of the relationship between media and politics, and the way that all of these ideals, these kind of foundational ideas about, like, the media is there to inform the government and to tell them about problems that are happening in society. It's been doing this, campaign groups, journalists, investigative reporters, not the kind of, headlines of newspapers or major TV reports, but like the background hum of journalism has been talking about homelessness, poverty, post office scandals, corruption and cover-ups, toxic masculinity, for years and years, as long as they've been going on. But it's like politicians can sort of brush those under the carpet unless and until it becomes some sort of like spectacle headline grabbing thing for a couple of months. And then their response isn't to kind of put their hands up and say, yeah, we're sorry, we've sort of realised we've fucking fucked up on this and completely ignored it, and now we've the tide of political and public attitudes to this is too strong for us to ignore, and we simply have to do something. The response is, make a show free, make a Netflix show free in schools. That'll solve the problem. We're not going to really do anything. The problems are too complex. There's no silver bullet, Keir Starmer said, so we don't have to do anything. We can just make this show free in schools. 13-year-olds will watch it and go, yeah, I know who Andrew Tate is, mate. Why are you making me watch this? Can I go now? And like, the government are not doing anything. So, bravo to the producers of Adolescence for making a very technically impressive and probably not that actually narratively interesting show. Bravo for Keir Starmer for finding another excuse not to fucking do anything.
Well, these are the basic dynamics of communicative capitalism, as Jodie Dean described it quite a long time ago, and it has only got worse since then, of like, yeah, there's endless opportunities to have discourse about a thing, and ever narrowing opportunities to have any kind of influence over the way that decisions are made by those in power. I guess it also makes me think of, that whole moment around sex and relationships education that happened a couple of years ago, the big kind of scandal. There was a culture war moment around it where they said that these organizations that were going into schools were teaching kids about, rimming or something. And it was, based on some completely inflated, or it was basically, a particular individual who was employed by one of these organizations in their adult sex education classes had some materials on this kind of thing, or like choking. I think it was choking. That was the thing that they were getting very cross about. But this obviously wasn't a thing that they talked about in schools. And I actually have a friend who worked for one of the organisations that ended up being kind of, on the chopping block at this moment. And her describing what it was like to go into schools and try and run these sessions, she wasn't trying to do sex education. She was trying to talk about consent. But the kids were not at all interested. What the kids wanted to talk about was sex. What the kids wanted to do was to, for her to... She was like, if I went in and did the thing that the cultural warriors said I was doing, the kids would have been so much more engaged. But yeah, this I guess we always have to see these conversations as like, in some ways, perennial ones about like, what are the youth doing? We don't know what's going on. And these difficulties of like how you have like truthful, intimate conversations about what is going on in young people's heads when they're precisely at a moment when they're really like, there's big social penalties if you actually go to the adults about any of your problems. And then we're in this moment of what the online spaces allow for. Obviously the kind of social media platforms, YouTube, but also like the gaming platforms, like they allow for these interactions to happen between adults and young people that sometimes their parents literally have no insight into. It's different than when like we were kids and like you might watch the TV late at night and maybe you'd watch a film that scared you and maybe you'd watch something that was kind of pornographic. At the very least, your parents could like flick through the Radio Times and maybe understand what it is that you might have watched. And like there's something in this anxiety about this disconnect between generations. But there also are, it's like you're saying, Chivers, like the levers and the mechanisms. Keir Starmer saying there's no silver bullets. It's like, no, there's no silver bullets, but there also are clearly understood and defined ways of creating spaces where young people can have much healthier relationships with each other and with adults who can model better behaviours to them. For example, with youth workers at their youth club. Or this thing of like, reinstate this stuff around sex and relationships education that got shut down by the Conservatives in the context of this culture war, and actually be trying to create these spaces where young people can be encouraged to talk about consent in this, consent and boundaries and what is a good way to treat each other in this context that is not like a lot of what they kept saying in this culture war moment was it should be the teachers. Why are you bringing in these external people? It should be the teachers. It's like, but the teacher is precisely the person who's in this like institutional role who they're never going to be honest with. They're not going to be able to say what is going on for them. And it's, it actually played out in the Rotherham scandal as well, and the grooming gang stuff, that there were particular organisations who were working there who had the relationships with the young people where they knew what was going on, and they were not supported, and in fact they were shut down. And so yeah, I suppose it is. I totally agree, Chivers, that there's something very, very frustrating about um, like what you have to build and you have to support is the social infrastructure, which allows young people to become part of community. And that means engaging with adults who are not their parents, who are not their teachers, who are not some YouTuber who has gamed the algorithm. Um, yeah, and allowing them to come into some sense of who they want to be as an adult, who they could be as an adult, that's not just within these like uh, clear these relationships where there's these clear big divides of power between them and the adults around them, which just means that they like put the walls up and you'll never know what's going on.
Yeah, and I think crucial, like there's another element to that as like, participation in media is also like something which is completely shut off for young people, right? In all these conversations I've seen about adolescence, it's been parents talking to other adults about like, I watched it with my children and I was shocked. I couldn't believe this. I've not yet seen any kind of mainstream media outlet interview a young person and kind of ask them, hey, do you see this stuff? What's your experience of like toxic masculinity? There's no, this is something that's, been going on in sort of like charity spaces and children's rights groups. Is like children are kind of, it literally seen and not heard in the media, right? The voices and perspectives of children themselves and young people to talk about their own approaches and perspectives on these issues. It's just something that never comes across the minds of like mainstream media commentators. And like this show could have been an amazing opportunity, and there's still an opportunity for it to become this, but like a space to like involve young people in a national conversation through the media, through these platforms that are meant to be like there to represent the public voice and to shine lights on difficult issues. But so far it's just sort of commentators patting themselves on the back and saying, "Oh, aren't we brilliant for noticing this all of a sudden?"
Well, okay. Well, look, here's the thing. I'm gonna push back against that a little bit because that bit is on us. Like, I don't think we should have expectations of institutions that do what they do to do anything but what they do. This has opened a cultural moment. Weirdly enough, last year, a friend of mine who does sort of anti-fascist community organising and works with young men, usually young men who are excluded in some way from schools, he'd been telling me that over the past couple of years, he's like, they walk in and they say verbatim, word for word, what Andrew Tate said. Like, they're saying these things like actual, and he said they're saying things that I never used to hear because he worked with young men for a long time. I didn't used to hear them saying these things and acting that way, and the way that they are thinking about how they treat women and you know people is mind blowing to him. And then a couple of months ago, I was in a room with a couple of teachers, and they started telling me, like, they're female teachers, and what they are, the way they are being treated by young men, they hadn't experienced in the previous decade. But young teenagers are getting up and saying, "You can't teach me. You're a woman." Like, that's fucking crazy to me. That was news to me. Right. And I'm aware of how polluted this space is, this information space is, and how toxic people like Andrew Tate are, partially, by the way, because it has to be acknowledged, because he's charming, convincing, engaging, and more, right? Like, so he's a very dangerous person to kind of like deal with, because if you just make him out to be rabidly disgusting, which he represents disgusting points, you're going to be seen as someone who like doesn't recognize like that sometimes he's kind of funny for basically someone who's also a criminal, probably, allegedly, seemingly. But we as a culture are not dealing with that as an entire nation, right? Like, if I hadn't known teachers, I wouldn't know that that's what they're going into school and saying, right? Like, so that this show comes along and people start talking about it, then it's on you and me, Tom and Debs, particularly yourself, you work in media reform, to go, this is what needs to happen. And fantastically, actually, for the audience and to bring us home, we're going to be doing an interview with Adele Zainab Walton, who wrote a brilliant book that will be coming out at the end of this month or beginning of next month, called Logging Off, The Human Cost of the Digital World. And I started reading it, and then I immediately stopped because I wanted to read it just before I did the interview with her, and look out for it when it comes out, because I wanted it to be fresh, because there's some great lines in there. But one of the ones that stuck with me is that, we decided we needed seatbelt laws. It's that we didn't decide that we needed to stop driving cars. We just needed seatbelt laws so that less people were dying because of cars, because of driving. We can do the same with the internet and information, because in the book she charts the people who are dying she tells like a story. I don't want to give it away, actually. Again, really eye-opening stuff that I was just not aware of. And again, I'm living in this space. So I think a show like this is really important. If it gets people talking about this, I think we can go further. That's our job. So I think Adolescence has been useful in bringing to light something that was maybe only spoken about in certain circles. And hopefully here today, we've talked about it and talked about other things in an interesting way that helps bring it further to light. But let's talk about, as we go on, what those seatbelt laws for the internet would look like. Let's talk about how we can make our world a bit of a better place. And let's encourage you guys to go out, form your news clubs, spend time with other people talking about not only the news, but what we do about it, because that is how we're going to see a better world for all of us.